In the quiet maternity ward, the air was thick with tension. A new mother, exhausted but glowing, looked at her newborn with a fierce protectiveness. Moments ago, she had brought her son into the world in this small-town hospital, an experience meant to be filled with joy and tenderness. Yet, as she held her baby close, she sensed an unsettling, judgmental stare upon her, one that filled the sterile room with an uncomfortable chill. The nurse, standing by with a clipboard, pursed her lips as she observed the new mother and her child. There was a palpable distance, a flicker of disapproval in her eyes, an edge of something that didn't belong in a place of healing. The mother, aware of it, met the nurse's gaze, but rather than warmth, she was met with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, a look laced with subtle disdain. "Should I just take him now?" the nurse asked, her voice clipped and cold, breaking the stillness of the room. The new mother, taken aback, clutched her child closer. "Take him? Why would you need to take him?" The nurse gave a tight-lipped smile. "It's routine, of course. We take newborns to run a few checks. Make sure everything's in order." But something about the nurse's demeanor made the mother's chest tighten. Her gaze lingered on the woman's hands, which stretched out, reaching for the baby in a way that felt possessive, not professional. It was a touch too eager. That moment stretched, the mother's instincts kicking in, warning her of an unspoken danger. The nurse's tone hardened, an edge seeping through her professional facade. "I know you must be tired. Maybe it's best if I just..." "No," the mother cut in, her voice firmer, trembling slightly. "I'd like to keep him here with me." The nurse's expression flickered with something darker, almost impatient. She tilted her head, glancing sideways before muttering under her breath, "Maybe he would be better off elsewhere." The mother felt her heart pound. "Excuse me?" The nurse smirked, a cruel, calculated glint in her eyes. "Look, you should understand. Some children, they have better chances in different hands." Her words dripped with insinuation, and the mother could feel the sting of each one. There was no mistaking the message behind those words, a message rooted in prejudice, aimed to wound. A surge of anger mixed with fear welled up within the mother, her grip on her son tightening. "What are you saying?" The nurse raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Nothing you should take personally, of course. Just, some families might be better suited for a healthy future for a child like this." Her gaze dropped to the baby, dismissive, cold, and the mother could barely believe what she was hearing. The words, the tone, the assumption, it all boiled down to one thing. She wasn't seen as enough, not fit to raise her own child in the eyes of this woman who had just met her. "I want to speak to someone else," the mother demanded, her voice catching as a whirlwind of emotions churned within her, hurt, anger, and a gnawing sense of dread. But her words were met with a low, dismissive chuckle. "Fine," the nurse said, shrugging. "But just remember, sometimes it's hard to know what's best when you're too close to a situation." She turned to leave the room, a twisted smirk on her lips, and the mother was left there, clutching her son with an overwhelming urge to protect him from the cold judgment she had just endured. This was supposed to be a safe place, a place where life began. But in this moment, it felt like a battlefield, with only the flimsiest veil of civility protecting her from something far more sinister. Minutes ticked by, each one dragging out as the mother tried to process what had just happened. Every instinct told her to hold on to her child, to keep him close, but a creeping fear lingered. What if the nurse returned, this time with a justification, a reason to take him away under the guise of hospital policy? The thought was unbearable, yet she felt trapped, uncertain of whom to trust. Alone in that sterile room, her pulse quickened, the walls seeming to close in as she replayed the nurse's chilling words in her mind. She didn't know how much time had passed before the door swung open again, and the same nurse re-entered, a determined glint in her eye. This time, she didn't bother with pleasantries or even the pretense of concern. "We're taking the baby for tests," she announced, her voice commanding, as if any protest would be futile. "Wait," the mother said, her voice faltering but defiant. I never agreed to that. The nurse sighed, a look of exaggerated patience on her face. It's really not up to you, is it? The mother's chest tightened. She could feel her heart pounding as she clutched her baby tighter, her body acting as a shield. Yes, it is up to me, she managed to say, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. But the nurse stepped forward, a hardened glint in her eye, her fingers stretching out as if to pry the baby from her arms. Don't make this difficult, she hissed, her voice a cold warning. In that moment, the door swung open again, and a figure strode in, filling the room with a new tension. The nurse froze, a flicker of recognition and something close to fear flashing across her face. It was the hospital's owner. His arrival was abrupt, catching her off guard, and for a split second, the arrogance that had twisted her face disappeared. What's going on here? He demanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. The nurse opened her mouth, faltering, searching for words. But there was no hiding the truth, no disguising the power struggle that had unfolded in his absence. The new mother clung to her baby, trembling, and the owner's eyes took in the scene, the nurse's cold stance, the mother's desperation, the unspoken threat lingering in the air. His gaze hardened as he looked back at the nurse. Explain yourself, he said, his tone leaving no room for evasion. The nurse stammered, casting a quick glance at the mother and child, but there was no explanation she could give that wouldn't expose her actions for what they truly were. Her confidence crumbled, her mask slipping, and in that moment, the mother felt the weight of her fear and anger begin to lift. Justice was in the room now, and she clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, someone was finally on her side. What followed would leave everyone who witnessed it stunned. The nurse's carefully crafted image shattered as her intentions were laid bare, and her downfall would be swift, public, and unforgettable. The truth, once exposed, would turn the tide against her, and the price she would pay would echo far beyond the walls of that hospital room. But how did it all unravel? What consequence awaited the nurse for her prejudice and cruelty? Stay with us as this story unfolds, revealing the shocking turn of events that no one in that small-town hospital could have anticipated. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. This story, like many others we share, shines a light on injustices that still exist and reminds us of the strength within our communities. We honor and support everyone who faces discrimination, and our goal is to uplift, inspire, and call for the respect everyone deserves. Enjoy the story, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe to stay connected with powerful narratives like this one. Thank you for being here. Now, let's dive into today's gripping story. In a modest town in the heart of Georgia, a place where old prejudices hung like shadows, Layla had spent her whole life learning how to guard her dignity in the face of quiet injustices. She was strong, a kind of strength that came from experience, from understanding how to hold her head high and navigate around the stifling judgment that seemed to linger in certain places. Now, at the age of 28, she was about to experience motherhood for the first time, a moment she had dreamed of since she was young. Layla had always been a fighter. She'd grown up knowing the unspoken rules of survival, the looks she'd receive when she walked into certain stores, the voices that would hush when she was around, the quick dismissals in professional settings. She'd experienced it all, but nothing had ever broken her spirit. That resolve had served her well, especially now, as she found herself in one of the finest hospitals in town, where her husband, Darren, served as the director. Darren was known for his dedication to his work, his commitment to the health and well-being of his patients. To him, this hospital was more than just his place of employment, it was a part of him, a responsibility he carried with pride. Their marriage was an anchor, a love that had faced trials and grown stronger over the years. Darren was the kind of man who brought calmness to Layla's life, a steady presence that she could lean on, especially when the world seemed to push against her. But now, as she lay in the hospital room cradling their newborn son, a nagging feeling of unease crept in. The town had whispered about Layla and Darren for as long as they could remember. A successful black couple in a position of influence was a rarity around here. They'd built their lives despite the expectations that others placed upon them. And as Darren's career advanced, the scrutiny grew. Layla often felt that they were watched, judged, and subtly tested by people who couldn't quite accept the image of a happy, successful family like theirs. Darren, with his unfaltering professionalism, often brushed it off. He believed in his work, in the hospital's mission, and he trusted the team he had built. But Layla knew that behind the polished surfaces, there were still remnants of prejudice hiding in the hospital's walls. The night before their son's birth had been one of anticipation, excitement, and hope. Layla had felt her contractions intensify, and Darren had whisked her to the hospital, a place where they were both known, where faces were familiar, and where they trusted their son would be welcomed safely into the world. As she gave birth, surrounded by supportive nurses and caring doctors, she felt a moment of peace. Her son, Isaiah, entered the world with a powerful cry, and she held him close, feeling the warmth of his tiny body against hers, a bond forming that was deeper than she could have ever imagined. But not everyone in the hospital shared the joy and warmth that Layla and Darren felt. Serena, a senior nurse with decades of experience, had her own views that ran deep, shaped by biases she had carried for years. Serena saw herself as a guardian of tradition, of the hospital's legacy. She had built her reputation on a particular kind of authority, one that did not favor change, and especially not the kind that Darren represented. To her, Darren was an outsider, someone who had altered the dynamic of the hospital, opening its doors to patients and staff who Serena believed didn't belong. Serena's dissatisfaction with Darren's leadership was no secret among the staff. She saw him as a man who had disrupted the natural order, a figure who dared to defy the silent rules that had governed the hospital long before he arrived. She watched as more diverse staff were hired, as patients from different backgrounds walked through the hospital doors, and with each change, her resentment grew. But it wasn't just Darren who bothered her, it was Layla, a woman Serena viewed as unworthy of the respect the hospital had to offer. When Serena learned that Layla was admitted to the hospital to give birth, she felt an internal resistance, a bitterness she couldn't quite hide. The idea of this family, one that symbolized everything she resented, bringing a new life into the world in her hospital made her seethe. She kept her emotions hidden behind a professional mask, yet there was an unmistakable sharpness in her gaze whenever she looked at Layla, an almost imperceptible disdain that colored her interactions. Layla, who was sensitive to the undercurrents of judgment, picked up on Serena's attitude almost immediately. There was a stiffness in the way Serena handled herself around her, an edge to her words that Layla had seen before in other places, in other faces. It was as if Serena was measuring her, weighing her, and finding her wanting. The first days after Isaiah's birth were challenging. Layla was recovering, learning the rhythms of motherhood, and Darren was at her side as much as he could be, balancing his duties as director with his role as a new father. Yet, every time Serena entered the room, Layla felt a chill settle over her. Serena's words were brief, her tone curt, her gestures clipped. Layla could tell that Serena's glances held something more, something personal and pointed. One afternoon, while Darren was handling an urgent matter elsewhere in the hospital, Serena entered the room, her expression unreadable. She began her usual routine, checking Layla's vitals and muttering observations, her words laced with a coldness that Layla couldn't ignore. As Serena reached out to check Isaiah, Layla instinctively pulled him closer, sensing a possessiveness in Serena's gaze that she didn't trust. Serena noticed, and a tight smile crept across her face, one that held no warmth. "You know, it might be better for the baby if you were taken to the nursery for a little while," Serena said, her tone deceptively soft. Layla hesitated, feeling a pang of anxiety at the thought of her son being away from her, even if only for a short time. "I'd rather he stay here with me," she replied, her voice steady but laced with a subtle edge of defiance. Serena's smile faded, replaced by a hardened look. "I've worked in this hospital for 30 years, she said, her tone shifting, a note of authority creeping in. "I know what's best for newborns." The implication was clear, and it stung. Layla felt a mixture of fear and anger rise within her, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm sure you do," she replied quietly. "But he's my son, and I'll decide what's best for him." Serena's eyes narrowed, her mask slipping just enough for Layla to catch a glimpse of the contempt beneath. "Suit yourself," she muttered, turning to leave the room. But before she did, she paused, casting one last, lingering look at Isaiah, a look that sent a chill down Layla's spine. When Darren returned, Layla recounted the interaction, a sense of unease settling over them both. Darren's face darkened as he listened, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a rare flash of anger. "I'll talk to her," he said firmly, but Layla shook her head. "I don't want to cause trouble," she murmured. "Just, be here, when you can." "I don't trust her." Darren stayed with Layla as often as he could, but his responsibilities often pulled him away. In his absence, Serena's presence seemed to loom larger, her coldness growing more apparent, her resentment more visible. Layla's every attempt to assert her maternal instincts was met with subtle resistance, a quiet but relentless campaign of intimidation that left her feeling vulnerable and isolated. Yet, through it all, Layla held on to her strength, determined to protect her son, to stand her ground. She knew what Serena was trying to do, and she wasn't about to let anyone make her feel less than capable, less than worthy of being Isaiah's mother. The days passed in a haze of tension, each interaction with Serena chipping away at Layla's patience. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained, but she refused to let herself be worn down. This was her moment, her right as a mother, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. The stage was set, the lines drawn. Layla was ready to face whatever came next, to protect her son against anyone who dared to challenge her. She could feel it in the air, the culmination of every slight, every moment of judgment, every word left unsaid. The quiet battle between her and Serena was about to reach its breaking point, and Layla was prepared to do whatever it took to keep her family safe. The silence of the hospital room grew thick, each second stretching with a quiet unease as Layla lay in her bed, watching the door. Isaiah rested peacefully in her arms, his tiny breaths steady against her chest, but her own heart beat in waves of apprehension. The confrontation with Serena earlier had left her unsettled, but it wasn't just the words they had exchanged, it was the look in Serena's eyes, the unsettling confidence that made Layla feel as though she were merely an obstacle standing in the way of something the nurse wanted. Darren, on his brief visits between hospital rounds, tried to soothe her worries, brushing off Serena's behavior as no more than an older nurse caught up in her ways. "She's all talk, Layla," he'd said, taking her hand in his thumb stroking gently over her knuckles. "She's been here for decades, and she's used to running things her way. But this is our son, and you're his mother. That won't change, no matter what she says." Layla had nodded, trying to absorb his reassurance, but the feeling lingered. As much as she wanted to believe that Serena's attitude was nothing more than a harmless show of authority, something in her gut told her otherwise. The next morning, after a fitful night of sleep, Layla woke to see Serena already in the room, adjusting the blinds and moving about the space with a brisk efficiency that felt intrusive. Layla blinked, her mind still foggy from sleep, trying to shake the unease that Serena's presence brought. "Good morning," Serena said, her voice clipped, the usual politeness absent from her tone. Her eyes flicked down to Isaiah, who was nestled against Layla's chest, and for a moment, Layla thought she saw a flash of something unreadable, something cold. "Good morning," Layla replied, her voice cautious. She adjusted her hold on Isaiah instinctively, keeping him close. Serena made a show of checking her clipboard, her movements precise and methodical. "We'll need to take the baby for his tests soon," she said, not looking up. "It's standard procedure, you know." Layla felt her pulse quicken. "I'd prefer to stay with him for the tests," she said, keeping her voice calm but firm. Serena's gaze finally lifted, her eyes meeting Layla's with a hint of impatience. "That won't be necessary," she replied smoothly. "These are routine. We do them without parents in the room to ensure everything goes smoothly." Layla tightened her grip on Isaiah, feeling a surge of protectiveness that surprised even her. "I'm his mother," she said, a subtle edge to her tone. "And I'd like to be there." A tense silence filled the room. Serena's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Sometimes," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "mothers don't always know what's best. Especially when they're overly attached." Layla felt a prickle of anger rise in her chest, her heartbeat quickening. "Excuse me." Serena didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, unwavering, as if she were daring Layla to challenge her authority. It's not unusual for new mothers to feel emotional, particularly in cases where their situation is complex. Layla's mind raced, each word striking a chord of anger and humiliation. "My situation?" she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. Serena shrugged, feigning indifference. "I'm sure you understand. You're young, and you may think you have it all figured out, but not every environment is suited to raising a child." She paused, her gaze flicking pointedly to Layla, a subtle but unmistakable accusation hanging in the air. Layla's breath caught. She could feel her hands trembling as she held Isaiah closer, shielding him from Serena's gaze. "Are you suggesting that I'm not fit to be his mother?" Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but the words held a raw edge of defiance. Serena's expression softened, her smile one of false sympathy. "Oh, not at all," she replied, though her tone contradicted her words. "But it's important to consider what's best for the child. Stability, support, not every mother has the resources to provide that." "Isaiah has everything he needs," Layla retorted, her voice steady now, her anger fueling her resolve. "And I don't need anyone's judgment about my ability to care for my own child." For a moment, Serena's mask slipped, her eyes flashing with a glimmer of frustration, perhaps even resentment. But she quickly regained her composure, her smile returning, though it was colder now, lacking any semblance of warmth. "As you wish," she said finally, turning on her heel and exiting the room without another word. Layla exhaled, her entire body tense, her mind reeling from the exchange. She could hardly believe what had just happened. The thinly veiled accusations, the insinuations about her ability to care for Isaiah, it was more than she could bear. And yet, there was something else that troubled her, something beyond Serena's words. It was the look in her eyes, the way she had seemed almost determined. As if she were carrying out some silent mission, one that Layla was only beginning to understand. As the hours passed, Layla's discomfort grew. Darren, caught up in meetings and hospital business, was unable to spend much time with her, though he checked in frequently, his reassuring words a balm to her frayed nerves. Yet, despite his presence, Layla couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was an unsettling tension in the air, a sense of impending conflict that made her heart pound with a mixture of fear and anger. Later that evening, as dusk settled over the town and the hospital grew quieter, Layla found herself alone in the room with Isaiah, her mind racing with thoughts of what Serena had said. She wondered if Darren truly understood the depth of her concerns, if he could sense the threat that Serena posed, the silent battle that was playing out beneath the surface. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, and Layla looked up to see Serena entering once again, a clipboard in hand, her expression carefully neutral. "Back again?" Layla couldn't help but remark, her voice laced with sarcasm. Serena raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching into a faint smirk. "It's my duty to ensure the well-being of all our patients, after all." Layla watched her warily as Serena moved closer, her gaze drifting to Isaiah, who was sleeping soundly in her arms. There was something different about her demeanor this time, a quiet intensity that made Layla's skin prickle. Without warning, Serena spoke, her tone low and almost conspiratorial. "You know, there are some who might say that a child like this deserves better." Layla's grip on Isaiah tightened instinctively, her eyes narrowing. "Better?" she repeated, her voice cold. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Serena shrugged, her eyes fixed on the sleeping infant. It's no secret that certain advantages come with particular environments. Some families can offer stability, wealth, connections. Things that not everyone has. The implication was clear, and Layla felt her face flush with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "My son has everything he needs," she said firmly. "And I don't need anyone to tell me otherwise." Serena met her gaze, unflinching, her eyes glinting with something that bordered on hostility. "Of course. But it's not just about what you think he needs. It's about what's best for him. And sometimes, that means making difficult choices." Layla's jaw clenched, her heart pounding as she stared at the woman before her, realizing that this was more than just a clash of personalities. This was an attempt to undermine her, to cast doubt on her ability to provide for her own child. And it was clear that Serena had no intention of backing down. As Serena turned to leave, she paused, glancing over her shoulder with a faint, knowing smile. "Sleep well, Mrs. Morgan," she said softly. "I'm sure everything will work out, just as it should." The words hung in the air long after she was gone, a chilling reminder of the threat that loomed over them. Layla lay awake for hours that night, her mind racing with questions and fears. What did Serena mean? What was she planning? The pieces didn't fully fit together, but one thing was clear, she needed to be vigilant. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not even for a moment. When morning came, Layla was exhausted, but determined. She shared her concerns with Darren, her voice steady but laced with urgency. He listened, his brow furrowed, his expression one of growing concern. "I'll handle it, Layla," he promised, his voice firm. "Serena has crossed a line, and she'll be held accountable." But as the day wore on, Serena's presence lingered, a shadow that refused to be dispelled. Layla could feel the tension building, a storm gathering on the horizon, ready to break at any moment. She knew that something was coming, something that would test her in ways she hadn't imagined. And as she held Isaiah close, she couldn't shake the feeling that the next time Serena entered that room, everything would change. In the dim morning light, Layla sat on the edge of her hospital bed, Isaiah resting peacefully in her arms. She was exhausted, her body weak, but her resolve strong. Darren had promised to handle the situation, and she wanted to believe him, yet the fear lingered, a gnawing dread that made it impossible for her to rest. Serena's words echoed in her mind, those subtle threats disguised as concern, each one more unsettling than the last. There was no mistaking it, Serena wanted to take Isaiah away, to decide for herself what was best. Layla knew she had to stay alert. Just as the sun began casting a gentle glow through the window, a soft knock echoed against the silence, followed by the door opening slowly. Serena stepped into the room, her expression as controlled as ever, clipboard in hand, eyes cool and assessing. Layla's pulse quickened, and she straightened, tightening her grip on Isaiah. "Good morning, Mrs. Morgan," Serena said, her voice calm, too calm. She closed the door gently behind her, lingering by it a moment before stepping further into the room. "How are you feeling today?" "I'm fine," Layla replied, her tone guarded. "Just tired." Serena's gaze drifted to Isaiah, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It's understandable. You've been through quite a lot. That's why I think it's time we take the baby for his tests," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Layla held Isaiah closer, the subtle undercurrent in Serena's tone sharpening her instincts. "You said yesterday that the tests weren't urgent." "Well, plans change," Serena replied, her smile tight, a flicker of impatience crossing her face. "We need to ensure he's healthy. It's standard procedure, as I've mentioned before." Layla shook her head slowly, her heart pounding. "I'll stay with him during the tests." Serena's lips pressed into a thin line. "That won't be possible," she said, her tone hardening. "Some tests require a sterile environment. It's best for him if he goes alone." "I don't see why it would be a problem for me to be there," Layla insisted, her voice steady, refusing to yield. I want to be with my son. A flicker of frustration darkened Serena's face. She took a slow, controlled breath, as if forcing herself to remain calm. Layla, she began, her tone shifting, becoming more authoritative. I understand that you're attached to the baby, but we have policies in place. They're there for a reason, and as his mother, you should want what's best for him. The words stung, each one laced with an implication that Layla couldn't ignore. She met Serena's gaze, anger simmering beneath her calm facade. I do want what's best for him, she replied, her voice low and controlled. And right now, what's best is that he stays here with me. Serena's expression hardened, and for a moment, her mask slipped, revealing the cold determination beneath. She took a step closer, her voice barely a whisper. You don't know what you're doing, Layla. You're not thinking clearly. If you truly cared about his future, you'd let him go with me. Layla's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and anger flooding her veins. What are you saying? She asked, her voice shaking slightly. What are you trying to do? Serena's gaze flickered, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the bitterness beneath. There are people who could give him so much more, people who would ensure he has every opportunity. You think you're doing what's best, but you're not. And one day, you'll understand that. The word struck Layla like a blow, and she could feel the weight of Serena's judgment bearing down on her, the sense of powerlessness that she had felt growing ever since Isaiah was born. But now, as she looked into Serena's eyes, she saw something deeper, something she had refused to acknowledge until now. This wasn't just a professional difference. It was personal. At that moment, the door swung open, and Darren walked in, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene before him. His gaze flickered between Layla and Serena, sensing the tension that hung thick in the air. Is everything all right? He asked, his voice calm, but there was a warning edge to it, a quiet authority that made Serena's face pale slightly. Layla glanced at Darren, relief flooding her as she held Isaiah a little tighter. She wants to take Isaiah for tests, she explained, her voice steady but laced with the frustration she'd been holding back. I told her I want to be there with him. Darren's gaze hardened as he turned to Serena, his voice cold. Is there a problem with that, Nurse Serena? Serena faltered for a moment, her expression flickering between defiance and discomfort. She straightened, her voice cool but tense. Mr. Morgan, it's standard practice for newborns to be taken for tests without their parents. We're only doing what's necessary. Darren studied her, his jaw clenched, and Layla could see the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. I appreciate your concern for hospital policy, but this is my son. And as director of this hospital, I think I have a say in what's necessary. Serena's face tightened, and for a moment, her control slipped, a flash of resentment crossing her eyes. With all due respect, Mr. Morgan, she said, her voice barely concealing her frustration, I don't think it's wise to let personal feelings interfere with what's best for the child. What's best for my child is that he stays with his mother, Darren replied, his tone cold, final. If you have an issue with that, I suggest you take it up with someone else. The silence that followed was thick, tense, and Layla could see the conflict in Serena's eyes, the frustration, the bitterness that lay just beneath her professional facade. For a moment, she thought Serena would argue, would push back, but instead, the nurse forced a tight smile, nodding stiffly. Of course, Mr. Morgan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes cold as she glanced back at Layla, a silent message lingering in her gaze. I'll make a note of it in his records. With that, she turned and left the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Layla released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her body sagging with relief as the tension began to dissipate. Darren turned to her, his face softening as he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Are you all right? He asked gently. Layla nodded, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. I'm fine, she murmured, her voice barely audible. I can't shake this feeling that she's trying to take him from me. Darren's eyes darkened, his jaw clenching as he took a deep breath. "She's overstepping her bounds," he said firmly. "I'll make sure she doesn't get near Isaiah again." The reassurance in his words calmed her, but deep down, Layla knew that this wasn't over. Serena's determination, her subtle threats, they weren't something that could be easily dismissed. She had seen the look in Serena's eyes, the cold resolve that told her this was far from finished. Hours passed, the hospital growing quieter as the evening drew near. Layla felt herself slipping into a light sleep, Isaiah resting peacefully by her side. But her rest was short-lived. She was jolted awake by the sound of the door creaking open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Serena. Layla's heart leapt into her throat as she sat up, her eyes narrowing as Serena stepped into the room, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" Layla demanded, her voice tense, her hand instinctively reaching for Isaiah. Serena closed the door behind her, taking a step forward, her eyes cold, calculating. "I'm here to finish what I started," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Layla's blood ran cold, her body tensing as she held Isaiah close, her gaze locked on Serena. "You have no right," she whispered, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "You can't just take him." Serena's lips curled into a faint smile, a glint of malice in her eyes. "You're so naive," she murmured. "You really think you can protect him, don't you?" Layla's grip tightened, her heart pounding as she looked into Serena's eyes, seeing the hatred that lay just beneath the surface, the bitterness that had fueled this quiet battle between them. She could feel the anger building within her, the frustration that had been simmering for days finally boiling over. "I am his mother," Layla said firmly, her voice steady, defiant. "And I will not let you take him from me." Serena's smile faded, her expression hardening as she took a step closer, her voice a cold whisper. "Sometimes, what a child needs most is a mother who knows when to let go." Layla's heart pounded, a surge of anger and fear flooding her veins as she met Serena's gaze, unyielding, defiant. "I will never let go," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "Not now, not ever." At that moment, the door swung open, and Darren stepped into the room, his eyes widening as he took in the scene before him, the tension that hung thick in the air. His gaze hardened as he looked at Serena, his voice cold, unyielding. "What do you think you're doing, Serena?" he demanded, his voice a quiet fury. Serena hesitated, her gaze shifting between Darren and Layla, her composure slipping as the reality of the situation dawned on her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came, the silence thick and heavy as she realized the depth of her mistake. "You are done here," Darren said quietly, his voice filled with a finality that left no room for argument. "Leave now, or I will have you removed from this hospital myself." Serena's face paled, her control slipping as she glanced at Layla, a flicker of bitterness flashing in her eyes. But she said nothing, her shoulders sagging as she turned and left the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. As the door closed behind her, Layla felt a wave of relief wash over her, the tension finally breaking as Darren pulled her into his arms, his embrace warm, comforting. "It's over," he murmured, his voice a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. "She won't bother you again." But even as she allowed herself to relax, a quiet voice in the back of her mind whispered that this was only the beginning. The battle was far from over, and Layla knew that she would need all her strength, all her courage, to face whatever came next. Darren's presence filled Layla with a renewed sense of calm as he held her close. She felt Isaiah's steady breathing against her chest, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe that this dark chapter was behind them. But in the quiet of the hospital room, a strange tension lingered, like an unfinished story waiting to unfold. Serena's final glance as she left had been unsettling, a cold, calculating look that sent a chill down Layla's spine. Darren could feel her trembling, and he pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes with quiet concern. "Layla, you're safe," he said softly, brushing a thumb across her cheek. "Isaiah is safe. I promise you, she's done. I'll make sure of it." Layla managed a small nod, but the worry was still there, lurking behind her eyes. She's determined, Darren. I've never felt this way before, like someone was trying to take control of my life, our lives. It's more than just a grudge. She believes she's right. Darren's jaw tightened. Belief or not, she crossed a line. I won't let her near you or Isaiah again. Trust me on this, Layla. As she settled back onto the bed, Darren pulled up a chair beside her, determined to stay with her for as long as he could. He held her hand, grounding her in the present, but in the depths of her mind, Layla couldn't shake the lingering threat. The sterile silence of the room only heightened her unease, her senses heightened to every sound and movement beyond the door. Hours slipped by as she drifted in and out of sleep, her dreams haunted by flashes of Serena's face, her cold stare, the unsettling edge in her voice. And just when she felt she'd managed to escape the feeling, a sudden, insistent knock jolted her awake, Darren's head snapping up as he tensed beside her. The door opened, and another nurse entered, her expression anxious, eyes darting from Layla to Darren. Mr. Morgan, she said quietly, the board is meeting in conference room B. They've requested your presence. Darren's brow furrowed in confusion. The board? Why would they be meeting now? The nurse shifted uncomfortably. I'm not sure, sir. I was just asked to let you know. Darren squeezed Layla's hand reassuringly. I'll be back as soon as I can, he promised, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Stay here. I won't be long. As he left, Layla felt a wave of anxiety creep in, her hand clutching Isaiah closer. She sat in silence, the ticking clock on the wall the only sound as minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. She wanted to believe that Darren would handle whatever this meeting was, but something didn't feel right. Her gut told her this was no ordinary board gathering. Meanwhile, Darren walked briskly down the hallway, his thoughts racing. He couldn't ignore the knot of unease tightening in his stomach as he approached conference room B. He opened the door, his eyes scanning the faces of the board members, each one looking tense, some whispering among themselves. At the far end of the room stood Serena, her posture straight, a look of quiet defiance in her eyes as she watched him enter. One of the board members, an older man with a pinched expression, cleared his throat, motioning for Darren to take a seat. Mr. Morgan, thank you for joining us. I'm sure you're wondering why we called this meeting on such short notice. Darren nodded, his gaze flicking to Serena, who held his stare with unsettling calm. Yes, I am, he replied evenly. What's going on? The older man shifted uncomfortably, glancing briefly at Serena before continuing. Nurse Serena has brought a concerning matter to our attention, and we felt it was necessary to address it immediately. Darren's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing thin. A concerning matter? Serena stepped forward, her voice level, almost clinical. Yes, Mr. Morgan. I've had serious concerns regarding the well-being of your son, Isaiah. In my professional opinion, I believe his current environment may not be in his best interest. Darren's jaw clenched, and he could feel the heat of anger rising in his chest. And on what grounds are you making this claim, Serena? Serena's gaze didn't waver. In my time at this hospital, I have never seen a situation where personal connections clouded professional judgment to this extent. I've observed behaviors that suggest instability. For Isaiah's safety and future, I think it's necessary to consider alternatives. Darren's fists clenched under the table, his voice cold. This is my family, Serena. Your opinions, your observations, none of it gives you the right to interfere with our lives. Another board member cleared her throat, glancing between Serena and Darren with unease. Serena has filed an official complaint, Darren. We are obligated to investigate. Darren's voice dropped, a dangerous edge lacing his words. So you're telling me that because of her personal grievances, you're questioning my ability to care for my own child? Serena's gaze hardened. This isn't personal, Mr. Morgan. This is about what's best for Isaiah. And I think, deep down, you know that too. Darren rose from his seat, his voice steady but laced with fury. This ends now, Serena. I will not stand by and let you tear apart my family under the guise of concern. If you're so concerned about Isaiah's well-being, then you'll have no problem leaving this hospital and letting us live our lives. Serena's expression remained composed, her voice unyielding. I'm simply doing what's best for the child, Mr. Morgan. If you can't see that, then perhaps it's you who's blinded by personal feelings. Darren clenched his jaw, meeting her gaze with a quiet, simmering rage. You may have convinced yourself that you're doing this for his sake, but we both know the truth. This isn't about Isaiah. This is about you trying to control something that was never yours to control. A tense silence fell over the room, the weight of Darren's words hanging in the air. He turned, his expression hard, and walked out, leaving the board members and Serena staring after him. Back in Layla's room, the anxiety had settled into a gnawing fear. She held Isaiah close, whispering soothing words to herself more than to him. The door opened, and Darren walked in, his face a mask of controlled anger. He came to her side, taking her hand, his voice steady. They're trying to question us, Layla, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Serena filed a complaint with the board. She's questioning our ability to care for Isaiah. Layla's eyes widened, her heart racing. What? How can she do that? We're his parents, Darren. We're his family. Darren nodded, his gaze dark. I know. But Serena is trying to manipulate the system, and she's using whatever power she thinks she has to undermine us. Tears welled in Layla's eyes, and she looked down at Isaiah, a surge of protectiveness flooding her. I won't let her take him from us, Darren. I don't care what she says. Darren pulled her into his arms, his voice soft, fierce. She won't, Layla. I promise you, she won't. Just then, the door swung open again, and Serena walked in, flanked by 2 security officers. Her expression was unreadable, her voice cold and detached. Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, the board has authorized a temporary removal of Isaiah for further observation. We believe it's in his best interest. Layla's heart sank, panic gripping her as she held Isaiah closer, shaking her head. No, she whispered, her voice trembling. You're not taking him. You have no right. Serena's gaze remained steady, unfeeling. This is not a request, Mrs. Morgan. It's a directive. The hospital is acting in Isaiah's best interest. Darren stepped forward, his voice sharp, commanding. If you think I'm going to let you bully us into giving up our child, you're gravely mistaken, Serena. This is our son, and we decide what's best for him. Serena met his gaze, her tone chillingly calm. This is a decision made by the board, Mr. Morgan. If you refuse to cooperate, we will have no choice but to take further action. Layla clutched Isaiah, her voice breaking as she pleaded. Please, please don't do this. He's our son. We're his parents. Serena's expression softened, just for a moment, a fleeting glimpse of something almost human. But then it vanished, replaced by cold resolve. I'm doing what I believe is right, Mrs. Morgan. You'll understand in time. In that instant, the door burst open, and one of the senior board members, Dr. Green, entered, his face stern, his voice cutting through the tension. This has gone far enough, he declared, his gaze fixed on Serena. This is not how we handle situations in this hospital. Serena's face paled, her calm facade cracking. Dr. Green, he raised a hand, silencing her. Enough. I've reviewed your complaint, Serena, and I see through it for what it is, a personal vendetta with no basis in professionalism or concern for the child's welfare. Serena's composure faltered, her face flushing as the room fell silent. Dar. Green's voice softened as he turned to Layla and Darren. I apologize for the pain and fear this has caused. You both have our full support as Isaiah's parents. Tears of relief filled Layla's eyes as she hugged Isaiah close, her heart bursting with gratitude. Darren put an arm around her, a fierce look of protection in his gaze as he thanked Dr. Green. Serena, stripped of her authority, stood frozen, disbelief etched on her face as the reality of her actions settled in. Darren's grip on Layla's shoulder tightened as Dr. Green's words settled into the room, filling the silence with a powerful wave of relief. Layla could feel her heart pounding as she held Isaiah, emotions swirling from disbelief to gratitude. Dr. Green's presence brought a sense of justice that she hadn't expected, a sense of validation that lifted the weight that had been pressing on her for days. But even in that relief, a quiet tension remained. The aftermath of Serena's actions would leave its mark. Dr. Green, noticing their tension, offered a gentle smile, trying to reassure them. Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, he said calmly, I'll be handling the fallout from this situation personally. It's clear that there's been a severe overreach, and we'll be addressing it within the hospital administration. Darren gave a respectful nod, his face a mix of gratitude and residual anger. Thank you, Dr. Green, he replied. But this isn't just an administrative matter for us. She tried to manipulate us, to make us doubt our right as parents. That's not something we can just move on from. Dr. Green's face softened with empathy. I understand completely, Darren. Serena's actions have crossed every line of professionalism. Rest assured, the hospital takes these accusations seriously, and will be conducting a full review. Serena, who had been standing to the side, her face pale and her composure shattered, finally spoke, her voice trembling. Dr. Green, you know that I've always put this hospital first. I thought I was doing the right thing. Dr. Green's gaze turned cold as he addressed her. Your judgment was clouded, Serena. What you did was personal. You used your position to exploit a vulnerable moment for this family, and that is inexcusable. Serena's eyes flickered with a mixture of defiance and desperation, her voice wavering as she tried to defend herself. But Dr. Green, can't you see that I was only looking out for the child? I've seen families struggle before. I didn't want that to happen again. Darren's anger flared at her words, and he took a step forward, his voice low but filled with fury. You don't get to decide that, Serena. You don't get to judge us, to treat us as if we're incapable of giving our son everything he needs. That was never your decision to make. Serena opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to fail her. She glanced from Darren to Layla, her face crumpling slightly as the gravity of her actions became impossible to ignore. But despite the apology lingering on her lips, she didn't speak, as if holding on to the belief that her actions were somehow justified. Dr. Green observed her for a moment, his gaze filled with disappointment. Serena, I'm placing you on immediate leave, effective today. You are not to return to this hospital until a full investigation is completed. Consider this a chance to reflect on the responsibilities and boundaries of your role. Serena's face went blank, her hands gripping the edges of her clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white. On leave, she repeated, as if the words hadn't quite registered. But Dr. Green, this discussion is over, Dr. Green replied, his tone final. You've lost the trust of this family and, for the moment, of this hospital. I suggest you use this time to understand why that is. With those words, Serena's defiance crumbled, leaving a hollow resignation in its place. She nodded stiffly, her gaze drifting to Layla and Darren one last time before she turned and left, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. It was a departure filled not with dignity but with the sting of consequences finally catching up to her. In the quiet that followed, Layla exhaled, a mixture of relief and lingering tension settling over her. She looked down at Isaiah, who remained blissfully unaware of the storm that had just passed over their lives. Darren wrapped an arm around her shoulders, grounding her as they processed the weight of everything that had just happened. Dr. Green cleared his throat softly, breaking the silence. I can't express enough how deeply sorry we are for the pain this has caused you both. It's important to me, and to this hospital, that you know this is not how we operate." Layla offered him a small, grateful smile, though her expression held a hint of the weariness that had seeped into her bones over the past days. "Thank you, Dr. Green. It means a lot to know that someone is listening." He nodded, a gentle sincerity in his gaze. "Please, take all the time you need here. If there's anything else we can do to make you comfortable, you only need to ask." As he left, the atmosphere shifted, the air finally clearing, leaving Layla and Darren alone with Isaiah. They sat in silence for a few minutes, absorbing the calm that had replaced the tension. But even as relief settled in, the events left an unsettling imprint, a reminder that the trust they'd placed in this institution had been shaken, tainted by one person's prejudice. After a while, Darren spoke, his voice soft, almost reflective. "Layla, I know we're through the worst of it now, but what if she hadn't been stopped? What if Dr. Green hadn't intervened?" Layla met his gaze, the unspoken fears mirrored in her eyes. "I don't know, Darren." She was so sure of herself, as if she believed it was her duty to fix things. She thought she had the right to decide our future, as if we weren't capable enough ourselves. Darren shook his head slowly, a dark expression crossing his face. "People like her, they hide behind their positions, using their authority as an excuse to manipulate others. But this time, she couldn't hide." Layla nodded, feeling a sense of resolution settle within her, a quiet determination to ensure that no one would ever hold that power over them again. "I hope this investigation teaches her something she'll remember the next time she feels that urge to judge." Darren's hand tightened around hers, a silent vow shared between them. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, stronger and more united than ever. The experience had shaken them, but it had also fortified them, deepening their resolve to protect their family at all costs. A gentle knock on the door broke their contemplation, and another nurse entered, her demeanor warm, respectful. "Mrs. Morgan, Mr. Morgan, I just wanted to check in and see if there's anything you need." Layla offered a grateful smile, appreciating the genuine concern in the nurse's voice. "No, thank you. We're fine now." The nurse nodded, a slight smile on her lips. "We're all here for you. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." As she left, Layla let out a slow breath, feeling, for the first time in days, a sense of true peace. The weight of the past events lingered, but they were lighter now, softened by the support they'd received from those who truly cared. Later, as they prepared to leave the hospital, Darren and Layla walked down the hallway, their steps purposeful, Isaiah nestled safely in his carrier. The halls were quiet, the usual bustling of staff softened by the evening hour. But as they passed through the main lobby, Layla's gaze caught a familiar figure in the distance, Serena, her face pale, her posture rigid as she stood by the reception desk, filling out paperwork. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Serena's face twisted with a mix of anger and regret, though she quickly averted her gaze. Layla felt a flicker of pity, a complex web of emotions rising within her. Here was a woman who, despite her experience and authority, had allowed prejudice to consume her, blinding her to the very essence of her role as a caregiver. Darren sensed her hesitation and glanced at her, understanding. "You don't owe her anything, Layla," he said quietly. Layla nodded, her expression resolute. "I know. But maybe, she needed this. Maybe this was the only way she'd ever see herself clearly." They continued on, leaving Serena and the echoes of her actions behind, stepping out into the cool evening air that felt like a balm after the storm they had weathered. The world felt different somehow, as if the ordeal had opened their eyes to a deeper truth about resilience, about the importance of standing firm in the face of prejudice. As they walked to the car, Darren looked at Layla, a gentle smile tugging at his lips. "No matter what happens next, we have each other. That's what matters." Layla looked down at Isaiah, his tiny face peaceful, oblivious to the trials his family had faced to protect him. She felt a swell of gratitude, a fierce pride in the family they were building, a family strengthened by love and unwavering support. "You're right, Darren," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "We've been through the worst, and we're still standing together." They shared a look of understanding, a silent promise that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side, drawing strength from each other and from the love they held for Isaiah. The journey home was filled with a new sense of clarity, a deepened bond that would carry them forward. Layla knew that the path ahead would hold its own challenges, that the shadows of prejudice would likely rise again. But now, more than ever, she felt prepared, armed with a resilience that could not be broken. And as she glanced at Darren, she knew that whatever came next, they would meet it as a family, strong and unyielding. Layla and Darren returned home with Isaiah, settling into the calm and comfort of their own space, finally free from the tension and judgment that had haunted them in the hospital. They felt the weight of what they had endured, but that weight was softened by a deeper sense of purpose. Their family had faced a threat and emerged stronger, their bond fortified by a shared determination to protect one another. As days turned into weeks, Darren went back to work with a renewed sense of responsibility, determined to ensure the hospital was a place where all patients felt valued and safe. He became more involved in overseeing staff conduct, implementing a more thorough review process, and creating training programs aimed at fostering respect and understanding across every level of the hospital staff. He knew the system had allowed Serena's prejudice to go unchecked, and he was committed to changing that, one policy at a time. Meanwhile, the hospital's board of directors completed its investigation into Serena's actions. The conclusion was swift and resolute: Serena's position was terminated, her license under review. It was a decision that stunned her, as the full reality of her actions settled in. Losing her role, her reputation, everything she had built over decades was a shock from which she struggled to recover. The weight of her choices became painfully clear, and for the first time, she was forced to confront the beliefs that had fueled her actions. Left without the authority she once wielded so freely, Serena's life took a different course, one where she was finally held accountable for the prejudice she'd hidden behind her professional exterior. Darren occasionally heard whispers about her, tales of her bitterness, her attempts to re-establish herself elsewhere, but she faced resistance wherever she went. Her reputation had followed her, a constant reminder of her fall from grace. It was a path of her own making, a path that left her isolated, with only her regrets for company. As for Layla, her experience had left a mark, but it also empowered her. She became vocal about her experience, finding ways to share her story and advocate for others who might face similar challenges. She found support from other parents, families who had endured their own struggles, and together, they worked to create awareness about the importance of respect, understanding, and the right of every parent to raise their child free from judgment. Through her efforts, Layla became a local advocate, speaking at gatherings, supporting policy changes at local hospitals, and even consulting with Darren on his initiatives within his hospital. Her story inspired others, giving them the strength to stand up against prejudice. It was a quiet victory, one that didn't come with grand accolades but was felt in the lives of the families she touched, in the parents who felt seen and heard because of her bravery. Isaiah thrived, surrounded by the love and security his parents had fought so hard to protect. He grew up with the values they cherished, taught to stand strong, to respect others, and to recognize the strength that comes from unity. Darren and Layla's home became a haven, a place where love triumphed over fear, and their family bond only grew stronger. One afternoon, years later, as Layla watched Isaiah playing in the yard, she felt a quiet pride that was almost overwhelming. She knew the road they'd taken had been rough, that the scars of that time would always linger. But they had emerged on the other side, stronger than ever. She knew now that their story was one of resilience, a testament to the power of love in the face of adversity. As we come to the end of this story, we're left with an undeniable truth: prejudice, in any form, is a force that can only divide, harm, and isolate. Layla and Darren's journey shows us the importance of standing up for what's right, of protecting what we hold dear, no matter how daunting the challenge. Their courage didn't just defend their family, it changed the environment around them, inspiring others to rise above judgment and to embrace unity and understanding. Their story also reminds us of the power we hold when we choose empathy over prejudice, compassion over control. Layla's strength became a beacon for others facing their own struggles, her voice an example of how speaking out can lead to real, lasting change. And Darren's dedication to transforming the system from within shows us the impact of small, determined steps toward a more inclusive world. Think about your own life. Are there moments where you can choose understanding over judgment, respect over assumption? It's easy to let fear guide us, to look for ways to control what we don't understand. But in letting go of that fear, we open ourselves to a richer, fuller experience of the world and of each other. So, what are your thoughts on Layla and Darren's journey? Do you see reflections of this story in your own experiences or the world around you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story resonates with you. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more powerful tales like this, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Each story we share is crafted to inspire, to question, and to reveal the strength that lies within us all. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.